I'm Glenn Wasserstein, Glen Wasserstein. I'm an immigration lawyer with the Immigration Law Group.
What should people know going into this deployment of Border Patrol agents?
That when an ICE agent approaches you, be calm, and that you have the right to remain silent. No matter what, no matter your immigration status, you have the right to remain silent. If they come to your door, you should ask them immediately, do you have a judicial warrant? And if they don't, you have to say, you do not have my consent to enter. You can say that when they first come to the door, and then you can ask, do you have a judicial warrant? And don't open the door. Have them show you the warrant either through the glass or slide it under the door. Now, if you work at a business and they come to your door, you have to let them into the main public areas that the rest of the public is entitled to go to. However, they are not entitled to go into the private spaces, the kitchen, for example, or the employee areas. They need specific permission from the owners or managers to go into those areas.
On the ICE website, there was kind of information, and it was in Winston's story about the warrant and stuff. I think there's a little bit of confusion there. And I imagine in a situation like that, someone could be very nervous and say, I don't know what to do, I'm just going to let them in. I think there's some scare tactics going around saying you have to open the door.
Yeah.
So you can't stand your ground and say you are not welcome in here.
Absolutely. So they're using intimidation tactics, and it's actually against the law. So they're saying, they're banging really hard on the door and saying, we have ICE here, we have a warrant. But what they have is an ICE administrative warrant on either I-200 or I-205 warrant. Those warrants are self-created by ICE and do not grant them legal entry to your house. You have to give them permission to enter your house. You should not do that. You should always say, I do not consent. Do you have a judicial warrant? And they almost never have a judicial warrant. They're very rare with immigration. They're only in cases of criminal liability. So when they're looking for a criminal fugitive, they will have a magistrate signed warrant, but they usually don't. But they don't tell you that. They try to go with the confusion of the word warrant and imply that you have to let them in and have to let them inspect everyone's documents. Now, if they do have a judicial warrant, they're only restricted to that person on the judicial warrant and those areas on the judicial warrant. They don't need a nice warrant to arrest you. What they're saying on that website is, they're saying is we don't need a warrant to arrest. They don't in public spaces. So they don't need a warrant to arrest you in a public space. But for them to enter a private space, a home or a business, they need that permission or a warrant. So for example, for hotels, so I'm concerned about New Orleans and their hospitality industry. So for hotels, they're allowed into the lobby, for example. Then they're not allowed into the semi-public spaces, for example, the hallways between the rooms, unless managers give them specific permission. They're not allowed into the hotel rooms unless the hotel occupants, the room occupants, give them permission. So even with the manager's permission, they can't go into that hotel room with an I-205 or I-200 warrant. They don't give them that permission. They don't give them that permission to go into a residence, and they don't give them permission to go into any non-public areas. So they can't knock down a fenced area and get into a construction zone. They can't do that. They have to have a specific judicial warrant to go into that zone.
Now, you mentioned in the warrant, if they do have a warrant and they're coming into your house, it's only for the person on that warrant. I think we've seen some instances from around the country where they'll sweep the whole family. So it's only that person. If you have a dad in the house, a grandmother, it's only for that person. So
that practice that they're doing is contrary to established law. They're supposed to be restricted to that warrant, to that person in that space. What they're saying is that the people around them, because they were speaking Spanish, have given them probable cause to believe that they're also unlawfully present, which is a real stretch of the term for probable cause. To me, it doesn't even rise to reasonable suspicion. So being Hispanic and speaking Spanish is not a reasonable suspicion of unlawful presence. That's established law. This government is ignoring that law.
Now, I want to ask because I think there's some confusion and some overlap between what people think between Border Patrol agents and ICE agents. Are those two, do they work under similar regulations? How does that work?
They have the same exact restrictions. ICE agents and CBP agents, which is Border Patrol, are both working under the same DHS immigration enforcement regime. They have the same rules, the same Fourth Amendment restrictions that they have. So the only The only special powers of the Border Patrol are within 100 miles of the border. And God knows we are far from the border.
now that you mentioned that, I wanted to ask because in the newsroom is the Gulf technically the border?
They're trying to say it is. It's not. And so if it ever gets before a court, I don't believe that will hold up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now you mentioned private spaces, public spaces, kind of like a construction zone. We live in New Orleans. There's 1,000,001 construction zones here. So I guess can you kind of explain the differentiation between a public and a private space in those kind of scenarios?
Sure.
Because everything's kind of, you see workers out in the open
Sure.
and working on Bourbon
Sure.
Street.
Well, if the workers are outside of the work zone and on the sidewalk with a workbench, or they're just having a break, they're fair game. ICE can come up to them. If they're behind a gated fence, ICE cannot get in there unless they have a warrant for their arrest, a judicial warrant, or unless the foreman lets them in.
Now, you talked about businesses. I've seen a lot of hospitality workers wonder, can we refuse them service if they come in? Are they going to come back if we refuse them service and demand and knock down the door and take our employees? What do you tell the people?
So I do not recommend refusing service. If they're just coming in for lunch, I think that's hostile. And they cannot refuse them entry to their public space. However, they can refuse to cooperate. They don't have to tell them who's working there. They don't have to grant them entry to any public spaces. They don't have to describe their immigration status. They don't have to tell them anything. They can remain silent. There's no probable cause that someone working there is unlawful.
Now let's talk about kind of bystanders and open public spaces. We've seen it all around the country now when they're trying to make an arrest. What is a bystander's legality? Can they be arrested? Tell me a little bit about that.
So an ICE agent can ask you, can approach you, and then it has to be a consensual conversation. So you can say to them, I am exercising my right to remain silent. And then you can say, am I free to leave? This is very important, to say I'm exercising my right to remain silent, and then saying, am I free to leave? If they're detaining you, they have to have reasonable suspicion that you're unlawfully present. So that's a certain standard that they have to rise to, that they're also unfortunately ignoring. So all these laws that I'm discussing, a lot of them, they're just ignoring them.
And if it comes to a situation where they're trying to arrest someone on the street and a bystander tries to help the person, and what are the laws and what are your rights there?
Never interfere in an arrest. Never, ever. Never give false information, and never interfere, and never run. These things will result in criminal liability. They can tackle you and arrest you if you run away.
Now, car situations, driver versus passenger, tell me about that.
Car situation. So if you're the driver and you get pulled over by an ICE agent or a 287G police officer, the driver must give them identification, insurance, and registration. The driver. The rest of the car can remain silent and does not have to provide identification or immigration status. However, currently, a lot of 287G police are ignoring the rules and arresting and detaining the passengers that don't have IDs.
I think those are all the questions I had about specifics. I guess just overall advice or words.
Okay. This is important. Don't be afraid to say no at the door. Say no at the door, because they cannot use that against you. If you exercise your right to remain silent, if you exercise your right to refuse a consent of a search, they cannot use that against you in immigration proceedings.